from feedback from Frido yesterday, we had that it's very difficult for people online to understand what are the discussion if we don't use the mic. So we have to be very careful about using that. From our discussion yesterday, so the proposal was to come back to the discussion about how heritable effects are integrated in the detriment, and there are there were some pending questions. So Aidana and myself, we have some new elements. So I propose we begin with that, and we finish the discussion. And also, Frido, you sent a list of comments yesterday, so maybe we can come back to that list also, and to make sure that the list of questions that we have is corresponding to the view of everybody. So Aidana, should we begin with you? And so in the meantime, thank you, Frido, for your email yesterday, and very helpful. I think we have to discuss it with everybody today and make sure that we can use it as one point of conclusion. And I'm pretty sure that all of you spend the night on this equation, just to make sure that you understand it precisely. And yeah, it was not.
Okay, good morning. I just tried to do some homework and prepare some explanation about the mutation component. Yes, this is from the ICRP publication 103, and they noted that the quantity of mutation component used in the equation provides a measure of the relative change in disease frequency per unit relative change in mutation rate for the different classes of genetic disease. Okay. Genetic disease. Yes. And the basic elements, as we discussed yesterday, was introduced in 1972, and within the framework of an ICRP task group, the problem was studied in detail and reported in the publication 83. And I just back to the publication 83. Okay. Sorry, could we move to the next slide? Yeah, this publication 83. Here. Obvious that if the population is exposed to radiation in one generation only, there will be a transient increase in the mutant frequency in the first generation after irradiation. Followed by a progressive decline over the next several generations, and the response of X-linked recessive disease to an increase in mutation rate is approximately similar to that of autosomal dominant disease, while the autosomal recessive is somewhat more involved, since a recessive mutation doesn't immediately lead to a recessive disease. And for multifactorial disease, the situation is more complex, since there is no simple relationship between mutation and disease. So this is a calculation. And that's the reason why mutation component was originally developed to handle multifactorial disease, but it's equally applicable for Mendelian disease. And okay, I just want to back to these calculations. For example, they calculated the mutational factor for each type of disease, and for autosomal dominant and X-linked, it was same 0.3 because they calculated the selection coefficient from the spontaneous mutation rate based on the mouse data from 26 of autosomal dominant disease phenotypes. And the average selection coefficient estimated from data on naturally occurring autosomal dominant disease is 0.294, and they rounded it up to 0.30, and they decided to use it for autosomal dominant and X-linked disease. For autosomal recessive disease, it's close to 0 because for autosomal recessive, the mutation component in the first generation is close to 0. Consistent with the fact that an autosomal recessive mutation doesn't result in disease in the first generation. And the rate approach to the new equilibrium is very slow and much slower than that for autosomal dominant and X-linked disease, and that's why it's close to 0. And it's very complex for chronic and multifactorial disease. It was calculated from 0.01 to 0.02. But in ANSCARE report of 2001, they decided to use 0.02 for risk of chronic disease because okay, and how the mutation component was calculated for multifactorial disease. They addressing the issue by formulating a hybrid model which included some elements of a multifactorial threshold model and some of the mechanistic models. I don't know, they make some mathematical or algebraic calculations. And they referred this model as the finite focus threshold model, FLTM. And the original intention was to use the model to estimate mutation component for both congenital abnormalities and chronic disease. But it soon became clear that its use for congenital abnormalities is not biologically meaningful. And so they decided to limit to use it only for chronic disease, for multifactorial chronic disease. Okay, this is some limitations from ICRP 103. And they describe that mutation component for autosomal dominant and X-linked disease is based on the average value for autosomal dominant disease, the selection component. But this is like overestimated. Is everything. And this is some calculations from ANSCARE 2001. And here you can see how radiation exposure will calculated in every generation. They use the baseline frequency, the mutation component, for example, is 0.3, the doubling dose, 1, the mutation component, and PRSF from 0.15 to 0.30. And this is the cases per million. Same for second generation. And here you can see the calculations for autosomal recessive and chronic multifactorial disease. And since the mutation component in the early generation is estimated to be about the same, the estimation of the risk to the second generation the same as shown above, and there will no noticeable increase. This one, back? Oh, okay. It's the baseline, yes, from the equilibrium. This one is doubling dose, it's 1 gray. And for mutation component, it's, for example, for autosomal dominant and X-link, it's 0.3. No. 60 per million.
Per million. Per million.
Per million, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
So it's 1.6%. One out of 100 or 1.6 out of 100 we have.
such a disease. Yes. And for the second generation, they also calculated, and then we have to add both numbers to get the.
No. What do you mean?
Because they consider 2 generations.
Yes, yes.
So altogether, we have between 2,000 and 4,000 cases in the first 2 generations. Sorry.
I think they have written second generation, so they are just talking about the second generation.
To the second generation. Yes. So should we then sum both, and then we have 750 plus 1,300 is 2,000, and 1,500 and 2,000 is 4,000. So between. Yes, but in the end, I think they considered heritable effects until the second generation, right?
Yes.
So this means that you have to sum the effects up. Or how did they do that?
I put some explanation.
Okay.
Maybe not clear explanation, but from Anskeya. And this is in 1 generation only. Okay, for each type of disease. And
because the calculation for the second generation is a little bit different than in the first slide you show.
0.7. In the first slide, 0.7.
But it was squared. And here it is not squared. So that's why you get a different number below. And then you get higher number here, then.
Frido, can you hear the discussion up to now? Or only when we are really speaking in the microphone? You are muted, Frido.
I'm sorry. So yeah, it applies to me as well. Only if the microphone is close, then I get it.
Okay. So we really have to be careful. Okay. Yeah, so we are still looking at the mutation component, and it seems that there are some differences between what is written in the NSCARE report and what has been used by the ICRP in publication 103.
Okay. And the next one, it's some explanation about the generations. The calculation shown above illustrate the kind of prediction that are potentially possible. The committee firmly believe that it's prudent to limit this prediction to the foreseeable future, namely the first 1 or 2 generations. And this is because of the reasoning that risk predictions at the new equilibrium imply the totally unrealistic and unstable assumption that first the circumstances, for example, the demographic and healthcare of human populations will remain constant over a very long period of time. And second, the estimates of the various parameters used to estimate mutation component and the other quantities in the risk equation will remain unchanged over the tens or hundreds of human generations. So I can't find any information in publication 63 and 103. So there's some small explanation in the Anscare report. This is from Anscare and calculations on also.
Yeah, just one reflection with regard to this statement from ICRP. If we check the footnote, the paragraph A, we say that there is a choice to go only to 2 generations because we want to avoid not to consider the evolution of demographic and healthcare of human population. And then currently we have no clear view on the evolution since the publication of healthcare and since the first calculation of heritable effects. So that means we may carefully consider what is which information is available on the baseline evolution of genetic disease. I was surprised by the terminology which was used, normal evolution of disease, or I do not remember exactly, but the base, what is included into the baseline, as we discussed yesterday with epigenetic, we may have a significant evolution since the last decades or few decades, but I have no view on that. So that should be good if someone can get more information. Fredo, you want the floor.
Yeah, I didn't get everything that was said in your room, but there was the question of if the first and the second generation are just added up, and this seems to be the case. If in publication 103 you compare the tables A6.4 and A6.6, then you see that they indeed added the Mendelian and the other components of the first and the second generation, but then also they applied a factor of 0.4 because they say this does not apply to the whole population, but only to the reproductive population of population in reproductive age, and therefore the final numbers then look a bit different, are a bit smaller because you apply this factor of 0.4, but it is an addition of the first and the second generation.
Thank you for clarification. I just add now, Dominique, about this dose rate factor of 3. It's in Anscare, and what they say with a dose rate reduction factor of 3 traditionally used, and then in brackets, the original basis for which was provided by the studies of Russell et al. And I'm just checking which year, but this must be early, quite early, right? I just check. Wait a minute. So it's from 1960.
we should add about that. We should ask Richard, because there have been some make changes, and the paper by Calabres 1 month ago, maybe, about a strong criticism of how the Russell experiments were made, and that part of the data are now available that were not used at the time of in the 60s. And so I did not look at that, but I know that Richard is strongly involved in this kind of evaluation.
But Dominique, this is not, all this is not the task of this subgroup, right? So we had, this is one of the questions we have to the other breakout sessions, actually. So then we should write. Yeah, but I mean, we are discussing here the consequences for the system if there is any change, but whether there is a change needed, I mean, this should be discussed by the others. So we should write down the questions we identified. Okay.
As has been said yesterday, and we should try to list all the questions that we had here, and to see what is the best way to answer that. So about need for update and so on. But again, for example, the discussion we had on the at least on the MC, so the mutation component, it's outside of the radiation field, because it does not deal at all with radiation-induced effects. It just what do we know about the genetic component of different diseases in the population? Is it close to 100% or to 0? And their choice here has been that it was very close to 0, 0.3 for one, 0.01 for the others. And it has a huge impact finally on the calculation, of course. And for that, that's, as you may know, there has been a position open yesterday on the ICRP website. And the TG121 is looking for a genetician with able to understand the equation. I wanted the call to be written like that, but it's written a little bit differently because nobody knows about this equation. But yes, that's and if we look, there are many questions inside for each of the parameters, so we can list it. Yeah. So there were questions about MC, the source of MC. So compared to what I said yesterday, it seems that there is anyway some scientific ground around that. So I'm not an expert, but maybe the 0.3 finally is a good value for them. But also, I think we have to see if it has been updated since 2001. Yeah. And that's it. Are there additional questions on MC, on the equation, on the number of generations? And Aidana, regarding the number of generation, is it written somewhere in Unscare or ICRP? What is the difference, not between the first one and the second one, but between considering only the first and second and considering more, like 10? So to compare with, we can see the impact with publication 60, but in their process, the justification is that finally the 2 first generations is enough. So maybe in their calculation we have some information about what was the difference quantitatively, I mean.
I don't know this is related directly why they choose the only 1 and second generation, first and second, but here some information. It's publication 83 that with the selection coefficient, which is wrong, permanent doubling dose of mutation rate leads to a doubling of the disease frequency already by about the 4th and 5th generation, by which time the mutation the mutation component become nearly 1, and that's all. Yeah.
Frido, you have a comment, question?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that in this case, the Commission did make some effort and wrote about 2 pages in 103 about the question of 2 generations or more generations. And then they come to the conclusion that the heritable risk of radiation at generations 5 to 10 rather than 2 would not materially affect judgments. So they did consider arguments of unscare and further arguments. And in this case, I think we cannot blame them of of a shortcut or of being too easy with concluding that. They did make an effort to justify this choice. But of course, it has to be seen if the arguments are still valid and or there's new evidence which would say something about further generations, and it would have to change. But at least there's something in 103 that is substantial.
But for this one, I really think it's a question for Group A or for people involved in. Because clearly, again, here they were focusing only on genetic effects, so modification of the DNA, so as we understood from yesterday morning, we know that there is no epigenetic mechanisms that can have an impact on several generations after 2 generations. After that, we don't know what is the quantification of that. Is it important or only a small part? But it seems that it questioned the limitation at 2 generations, in my view. We have to discuss it with Zdenko or Cisco, I think.
Yeah, another point that you quoted in your slide is a discussion they had about threshold. And do we have only stochastic effect or some element with threshold? Finally, in publication 103, they decided to not consider threshold. So I do not understand clearly all the elements. That was one of your slides that you had on the mutation component. That not this one. No, or the other one. So I do not remember precisely the slide, but there is one where you discuss how they derive the mutation component. And they discuss that they try to apply the model, but finally they avoid the model and they come back only to stochastic effect. So beside what have been done in publication 103, it should be good to see if among the effect we need to consider threshold or not, or if some effect has with threshold, and what could be the consideration on that. Do we not consider them if they are deterministic and we take only stochastic? This is what have been done. But then we have to justify why we do that. And if there is, from the others group, they have information on the type of effect. We have no idea about threshold or no threshold for the effect.
Yeah, but at least what we can say is that chronic disease includes cardiovascular disease for approximately 1/3 of the baseline rates. And cardiovascular disease is considered as a deterministic effect or tissue reaction if it occurs in the person that has been exposed. Here, if it occurs in the offspring of the person that has been exposed, we consider it as stochastic, which makes a difference. So that's a real question. I don't think it's considered in TG119, but maybe that's a question that we should transfer to them, just to make sure that they have a look at the consistency of that. But cardiovascular disease is considered as a stochastic effect here, and as a deterministic effect for personal exposure. Yeah. Maybe it has to be transferred to both TG119 and TG123. I think it will be good that TG103 will have a look at that also. So. Other questions, comments on this equation? We did not came back to several of the parameters. It means that clearly this issue is, well, the weight has been integrated, calculated, and it means better understanding from our side and clearly update. And also some competencies that we don't have in TG121 at the time being. There was another point that was discussed yesterday. It was weighting by severity. So if you agree, we can switch to that point. Aidana, is it over regarding what you prepared for today? Okay. So yesterday I sent the question to two experts, so Enora Clero and Ludovic Vaillant, and so what we discussed yesterday was that the calculation of heritable effect that has been done by Unsker and integrated in the publication 103 is that the result is finally 20. It means 20 cases per 10,000 people. Okay. And that it's what we call the nominal risk, and it's calculated for gonads heritable effects. It should include also the risk of cancer for ovaries among females. But well, the value is the one that has been proposed by Unsker, 20 per 10,000. And the question yesterday was what has been used for the weighting, the severity weighting to reach the detriment value. Okay, you cannot see the table without the. Is it in presentation mode? I know I don't think so. Maybe I can. Can you put it in presentation mode? Okay. So we have this value of 20 here. And for cancer here, the lethality fraction it reflects the fact that the cancer is more or less lethal. So if you look for thyroid cancer, for example, it's very small because most of the thyroid cancer can be cured. But for some others, it's very close to 1 because we don't know how to cure it, and when somebody has it, there is a high probability of death. This is a coefficient which is reflecting the quality of life after cancer. The idea is that's an expert advice, and the idea was to consider the severity of the treatment, the burden of the treatment of the cancer, that the life after this kind of cancer was more or less difficult. And the last one is the number of years lost due to the cancer. The mean value is 15. It was calculated for the ICRP 90, so in 1960, in 1991. It has not been revised since then. And it was 15. And so it's a little bit less than 1 if the number of years that are lost after a cancer is lower than 15. It's 1 when it's considered it's 15, and it's more than 1 if the number of years is higher. So in fact, for cancers that occur early in life, in general, it's higher than 1, and for cancers that occur later in life, it's less than 1. The question is, how has it been calculated for this one? Because here it's coming from the literature about consequences of cancer. It's not from the radiation field. It has been calculated from what cancer experts know about the consequences of cancer. For this line, it's very surprising that the same coefficients has been used. So the answer I had from Ludovic and Enora yesterday, they went back to publication 103, they went back to publication 60. What you can find in publication 103 is that in publication 60 made the implicit assumption that all genetic diseases should be treated as lethal. In view of the range of severity and lethality for the various disease types of genetic disease, the lethality fraction for genetic disease has now been explicitly designed as 80%. That's what you have here. So it's not calculated exactly in the same way as for cancer, but the idea is the same. How could you reach only one value for all the different types of disease, which are including chronic disease and genetic disease and Mendelian disease and so on? That's really a rough estimate. So the 0.8 is really a rough, an expert advice. And furthermore, it has not been revised since publication 60, so since 1990. This one clearly we don't care because it's not good for cancer, so I don't expect it can be good for heritable effects, and yes, no, it was fixed at 80. Okay, you're right. I did not understand that. Okay. So why has it been reduced? I don't know. Yes, you're right. And for the relative cancer-free life lost, it is considered that the number of years lost is 20 years. I think because some of the effects that are considered, especially congenital malformation, occurs early in life. And so I think they consider that finally the years of life lost was more than the 15. And the 1.33 is just the relative value, 20 years divided by 15. So again, this value here for heritable effect is calculated from a mean, which is for cancer and not for all chronic diseases. Werner?
Now I'm again confused. When you talk about malformations, they are included here? Because malformations may have a threshold? I mean, what kind of endpoints are now? I thought this is all cancer. So cancer in the second generation. Yeah, this heritable.
The value of 20, but I'm speaking under control of Aidana. The value of 20, which is the final result of the N-scale, is considering the 4 categories of heritable effects. So Mendelian disease, chromosomal aberrations, multifactorial chronic disease, and congenital malformation. So it includes the 4 categories. And the four categories are very, very different in the way they occur over life, in the expression, in the severity, and so on. But as everything is calculated as one line, finally, you have only one line in the final table. But it's the sum. It's the sum of the four categories of. Yeah. That's what I understood. Yes.
Yeah, just this was quite similar because the 20 years of life lost, if it's really on congenital malformations, it should be revised because the survival of congenital malformations in the last years changed tremendous. So if it's really part of it, I don't think that 20 years will be valid anymore. Yeah, that's the problem. I mean, now I understand it right now. Yeah.
But to answer, these three values, I think, are from ICRP. There was no, I don't remember of any proposal from Healthcare for that. That's not their duty at all.
Yeah, what is not clear for me, because the 0.8 is the lethality fraction, which means that when you have an effect, then you take into account what is really what lead to death or not. In the calculation of the hereditary effect, we already have the mutation component, which may play part of the role, because you have the baseline incidence, but then the incidence is partly the modification of gene or some trace, but not expression of the effect. And then you have the expression of the effect with the mutation component, if I well understand the equation. And so it's why it should be checked carefully what is included into the mutation component compared to the baseline occurrence, and then to see what we have in the mutation component depending on the type of effect and what we can say about lethality.
So this is another question we have to the others: how these three numbers have been developed and whether they should be changed. Why maybe? I mean,
because my feeling from the work of TG102 is that it's not a good idea to try to have the heritable effects provided in the same way, in the same table, and so on. Clearly, I think it will be clearer if it was not one line, to have these lines and the weighting factors for cancer, but to have heritable effect, which is outside, added as something that we add with no, we don't know this 0.8. It's completely, they can propose, we can propose what we want, but we are not able to propose anything which is reasonable for such a large type of different disease. The same for the second coefficient and the 20 years. I agree with you. 20 years. It should be more than 20 years for some of the disease and much less for chronic disease, for example. So I don't understand the justification of trying to have this in the same way. And including, I think we should change it and not try that, and just say that we add a given value to the detriment, which is expert advice based on some of the parts which are scientifically based, and that's it. To change the way it is done, and I think in that case maybe. But that's outside of the discussion today. It may be the right way to do it also for cardiovascular disease, not to try to do it in the same way, but to say that by prudence, we have to do something and we have to add something. So maybe that's something that is in between. But I don't understand why they tried to do that this way.
Until yesterday, because I didn't know, I intuitively thought that it was done that way, that it was just added at the very end. That was my intuition. But yeah, I think I agree with you. It would be better to have it separated. And then with this approach, cardiovascular diseases could also be, if we wish, if we want.
But anyway, we can have a look at do we have information about for the 4 categories of this kind of information, yeah, and also what we have to look at is that in the end, the value for nominal risk is very similar to detriment. Don't ask me if it's by science or if it's that they decided to have something that was not changing too much. So using this coefficient, it's almost the same. And after that, in the summary tables, if you look at this table, they have a value which is proposed by Unscare, which is 20. In a population of 10,000 persons, you're going to have 20 cases, let's say, okay, lifelong. After that, there are some weightings, and the value here is almost the same. So I don't know if it was by purpose or not to change that. I don't know, because if you put 1 here, then it will be a little bit higher. If you decide it's not 20 years but 25 years, it will be a little. It is. There's the justification of this one, I think, is that they didn't wanted to have something different here than here, but well, that's.
Yeah, but then I fully agree that finally with this table, if you have not used weighted factor, it should have been more or less the same between 20 and 25, no significant difference. But then it's significantly depend on what you embark in the nominal risk. If in the nominal risk you have so many disease without significant impact on lethality, then you may have an increasing number in the nominal risk. But if you have no weighted factors, then you will have a significant risk, which basically, if I understand some of the proposal on the genetic effect, a large number, fortunately, are not too significant for impairing the life. So we need to have better characteristic of what is included into the nominal risk and which type of disease we consider. And based on that, do we need to have weighted factors or not? But of course, if we put a strong lethality factor, then you can forget about the weighted factors because there is no significant impact. But on the other part, if we have a large number of small mutation, genetic mutation, but where people can live without major problem, then it's another issue.
Other comment, and the last, if I move from one, this one you saw it already, I'm afraid. If we look at the final table, that's what we have here. Finally, heritable effect is 0.2. So because in the final tables that are used for radiation protection, it's rounded to one value and it's percent. Nobody understands per 100, but it's for 100%. There is 0.2 cases, and in fact, the fact that it moved from 0.2 to 0.25 do not appear neither, because it's rounded to 0.2. So and it's only 2 to 4%. And again, in publication 60, it was 14 to 18%. which was much larger. So there has been a huge change between ICRP 60 and. But well, we are discussing about a value which is very, very small. So do we need to go in much detail? My feeling will be that it will be much better to put it somewhere outside of this table, clearly to show that the uncertainty is very large. We propose something, but with uncertainty which is huge, and the effort is not so important. If we finally we stay with something which is very small compared to cancer, then I would prefer having the efforts, ICRP efforts on cancer and not and less on heritable effects. Yeah.
I really agree to you, and with all the discussion from yesterday and the morning today, I think we are clear that we more tend to that the momentum effects are too high. That it's maybe they are even lower. So what you said that the part on the effect on the sum of the detriment is even lower than we have now. So problems might, yeah, hard to discuss.
Except if Group A tells us tomorrow that epigenetics makes it double or more, and that we have to go up 10 generations, and that finally it's 4 times higher, and that we come back to 15% again. So in that case, it changed the things, yes.
Yeah, another point with this table, because we have all population and adult workers. In fact, in the calculation of heritable effect, this is done on reproductive population. So what to do with that? Do we add a specific category, which have been done in ICRP publication? And then from that you derive the average value for the whole population. But what does it mean for the whole population? Or do we restrict to reproductive population? But not so easy. So we at one point we need to check how far in detail we want to go. But clearly in the step of calculation, that will be done solely for the reproductive population, and then extrapolated in average, but then you reduce because the previous number were higher for the reproductive population, of course, and then you have a factor 3 or something like that for the risk. So it's give a different feeling for the population. And when we say the whole population, it's not completely meaningful to do the calculation for the whole population.
I agree with you also, and I think they did it as for cancer. They took 60% for the adult workers, which is not fair, because in fact providing only one value and being the same for a reproductive population, also workers or the whole population, would be enough in my view. There was no need to reduce it for the adult workers because it should be reflecting the reproductive population. I have to check that. Yeah, I don't remember how it has been done, or if there is a justification to apply the same reduction coefficient for adults compared to world population. Any comments online?
No, not at this point.
Sorry. Yeah, just one point to be considered. If we go toward one table with cancer and one table with hereditary effect, then we may have consequences on the effective dose. If we have not consolidated at the end, then it may, depending on the importance, if it is only a few percent, it will not change too much. If it represents 10% of the total risk, it may influence the calculation of effective dose. So we need to go prudently with regard to the decision to do it separately or not.
No, you're right. It has an impact on the calculation of WT. Maybe it was the justification to have it as one line. So they were able to calculate the WT for each of the components, and I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, can I?
You mean in the numerical results of the calculation, or just in the theoretical also formula for the calculation? So, okay, so you mean the numerical results of the calculation? Yeah, okay.
Yes, just for everybody to understand the comment from Thierry, it's just that the last column here is the relative detriment for each of the cancer sites. That's what is used to derive the WT. And so, of course, if we remove this line from the table, it's more difficult to calculate the WT integrating the AI table effects. So it means that we have to be careful before changing anything and to discuss with the committee too. It's possible to consider that it's not more one, but less than one or something like that. But at least that's a point that we have to be careful about that. Yes, sure. Frido?
Yeah, that's, I think, important to keep in mind that it has effects on the effective dose calculations. I just wanted to mention a minor point in that context. If you add the relative detriment of 0.044 and the one for ovarian cancer, which is 0.017, then you get 0.061. But the weighting factor for the gonads is 0.08. And in 103, they say that they are just adding a degree of caution, or they use a degree of caution. So they made this gonad weighting factor a bit bigger than it would come out from this relative detriment calculation. Well, on the one hand, you could say that's nice that they they give an added value to it. On the other hand, I'm lacking, or I don't see the reasoning for that. Why should it be? If it is really a small contribution, then it should be a small contribution. Why did they have a feeling that it should be a bit bigger, and what difference would it make?
Maybe just because WT for a table effect was much larger in publication 60.
For historical reasons, yeah.
Yeah, it's not a good reason, but maybe it's part of the explanation, yeah. So additional questions about how it is integrated in the detriment, how it is calculated, and what are the scientific basis for that? That's so we have to list it and for the summary for Thursday afternoon. But we have a chance to come back all together to that on Thursday morning. So if it's possible to have a first draft or slides, then we can have a look all together before the summary in the afternoon. Are there other questions on that topic? Do we move to the next point, which is your presentation, Thierry? Other comments on that? I'm pretty sure if we look in detail, we are going to find additional questions. Oh, sorry, Frido?
Yeah, I would just like to say that because I raised the question yesterday, do we take the doubling dose from animal experiments just as they are, or do we calculate it differently? It seems there's also a historical development there. I didn't understand it that way. Maybe it was said that way, and I just misunderstood. But it seems that in ICRP 60, the doubling dose was just taken from animal experiments as they were. But then in 103, they say that we have to take into consideration the rate of induction, which should be the same per gene and per gray in mouse and in man. And then we combine that with the background mutation frequency of humans. So the doubling dose that comes out of that and which is used in 103 is already a calculated value. It's not just taken over from the animal experiments, but it's a combination of animal rate of induction and human baseline mutation rate, which I think it's reasonable to think that way. But it's a difference in how animal experiments are taken in. The value is not much different. The value then, as Aidana presented yesterday, is 0.82 instead of 1. And then even the commission says that, but we continue to use 1 because it's easier and it's not such a, we are not so sure about this precise value of 0.82. So I thought it would be good to mention that, clarify that. Maybe it's only a clarification for me and you all understood it this way, but that's what my homework said yesterday.
Sorry, and what was your question?
My question yesterday was, do we take the doubling dose from the animal experiments directly, or do we have to do some calculations? And it seems, according to the new, the current recommendations, 103, we do some calculations. We take the rate of induction per gene and per gray from the animal experiments, but combine it with human data on the background mutation frequency, which is different from ICRP 60.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. Until the 1993, they used the mouse data for both of them, but after they decided to use the mouse data combined with the human, but the assumption that in the induced mutation, the rate of induced mutation in mouse same with the human. Yes.
Thank you.
So we stop there or no?
Just a small question. Do we have any information about UNSCARE work on this topic, and also possibly on NCRP, if they are if they have done some calculation on this topic, or if they envisage to do it? What to and then that should be good to have that in mind and to see if they have some proposal, some way of addressing this issue.
So unscared, they haven't done anything on the heritable effects since publication 2001. It has been reviewed by the ad hoc working group on effects. So they now have two expert groups in addition to the secretariat and the bureau. One on the effects, it's 5 or 6%, I think. One on the exposures, and so it has been revised 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, by the ad hoc working group to determine what were the best topics for their work plan for the next years. It has not been selected as something that was needing a review because there was not so much, and so they decided not to consider it. They launched something on cardiovascular disease. This year it will be neurodegenerative effects, cognitive effects. Next year it will be cataract and lens opacities. And in 2025, they intend to have an overarching report on non-cancer disease. And in this one, heritable effect is considered. Yeah, the title will change, but it should be in. I don't know if it's going to stay. The idea is to launch it in 2024, 2025. I don't remember. So there is still possibility that it will change. But also in the other way, we can write something to convince Enscare that some of the elements have to be considered carefully because it's needed for us. So yes, there is some possibility of exchange still, I think. Yeah, but at the time being, no, they did not. What I can do maybe is to have, it was 1 page, I think, the evaluation by the ad hoc working group of this topic, and the conclusion was that it was priority 2, and there were so many priority 1 that it has not been selected for the next years. That's the answer for Enscare. For NCRP, we have to check. I agree with you, maybe with Gaël Voloshak or somebody who is involved strongly in that, maybe you. But the last report of the NCRP was in 2013 on that topic, preconceptional and prenatal radiation exposure, health effects, and protective guidance. And but it was much more. You're not going to find in-depth discussions of the scientific basis. There is a review of the literature, and after that, most of it is consideration of operational aspects. Especially, there is a large part comparing the medical use of ionizing diagnostic methods compared to MRI and compared to echography. Yeah. But we have this, so I can circulate it to you if you want. That's a source of information. But as they did something in 2013, I don't think they intend to do a new one. But yeah. And after that, maybe we have to check also IEA, or I don't know, just to make sure that there is no parallel initiative. It's 10:15, so we have 10 minutes before the coffee break. Do you want to begin this? Should we spend the next 5 or 10 minutes just to try to make the list clearer for us? Do you think you have enough time to make your presentation? I think it's better to have it after and to take the time to discuss it. We can come back to that, yes. That's the list of questions that you received and that were circulated 1 month ago, approximately, to each of the members. So question was, is compared to the state of knowledge in 2007, what is the contribution of new scientific results on how to consider preconceptional effects of ionizing radiation in the assessment of risk in humans in support to the radiological protection system? I think we can change it a little bit and not to say what is the contribution of new scientific results, but what are the questions today and what we expect from a review of the scientific literature. And question 2 is coming with that, potential changes in the quantification of heritable effects. That's what we discussed. What are the type of effects? What are there variation in baseline rates that we can consider today and were not considered in the past? What about the number of generations that have to be considered? What about the extrapolation from experimental results to humans and the weighting by severity? So that's most of the question, but we discussed a lot more than that. So.
If we have a minute, can I ask another question? Because Werner before said that mentioned the inclusion or not of cancers which are perhaps induced through germline mutations. I don't think that has been included until now. And the question is there any evidence? I think I've seen a few papers that raise that question, but is there any good evidence for cancer induction through the germline? So cancers that would appear in the first, second, and more generations after the parents have been irradiated. Is that a type of effect that should be added, or is there no indication whatsoever that we should do that?
Mm-hmm. There is one other issue I just mentioned, is about the role of epigenetics, which should also be added here, which is a new topic, definitely, since 20 years ago. But the 60% we discussed before, systemic diseases, this include cancer. So.
Yeah, Frido, in the chronic disease, the 65% baseline rate includes all chronic disease. So it's not so clear what is in, but clearly it includes cardiovascular disease, it includes cancer, it includes metabolic disease. Part of it is like diabetes and so on. After that, I don't know if there is a precise list, but I think it was in your presentation, Aidana, but I'm not sure it's more precise than what we say now. But cancer is in for sure. Yeah.
Thanks.
In fact, it's almost all diseases except car accidents. So I'm joking, but I never read it before. I read it for TG 102. I was really surprised to see that and it's a specific report. It's publication 83. That's it. Multifactorial diseases. Maybe we have to. Thank you.
Yeah. Among the questions, we had the discussion about the calculation of the doubling dose. Do we consider that the model which have been proposed in publication 103 is still valid? Do we have new information about that and what to do? Who is a specialist of this topic and what to be considered? Because that could change significantly the calculation of the risk.
I mean, the question you are raising is there a dose response relationship or not? If not, then one should keep with this concept. If there is indication for a dose response, then maybe one can change that. So that's another question, yeah.
I don't know, will it be possible for you to summarize all the questions that have been raised? Yeah, okay. No, not right now. No, I think you have 15 minutes. No, that's a joke for
Sorry to be so so insistent. I just looked up publication 103, the section about multifactorial diseases, and there is mention of coronary heart disease and hypertension and diabetes and other things, but there is no mention of cancer in this section. Could you tell me where you saw this this long list of things which just included the excluded the accidents and included everything else?
I don't know. I think you had it in one of your slides, the types of disease.
So 103 doesn't seem to have cancer.
Okay, we will go back to this and we can check. But I'm sure that cancer is in the 65%.
Yeah, it should be. Yeah, I agree. But
Yes, for sure, because they update it regularly. But I'm not sure. Really, I'm not sure. We can. They are working on that. The classification of disease, the 10th was in 2000 or something like that. And so since that, it has been updated for cancer, it has been updated for specific, and so they are moving to things that are more and more detailed and more specific to one large category. But I think the WHO is thinking about a new complete set of classification. I don't know more than that. So we end up now, and we come back after the coffee break. So in the agenda, coffee break is from 10:30 to 11. So we come back here at 11, and to work on the list of questions. Aidana, can you circulate something to all of the group before tomorrow morning so we can have a look at it? Okay, good. And anyway, tomorrow morning we are all together and we look at the summary of the session. So it has to be finalized tomorrow morning. So for Frido and Geraldine, so you have we are having a break, and you're welcome back at 11.
Yes. Do we have to make our own coffee?
I'm afraid yes.
the list upstairs and the I'm not sure, but I found some lists in UNSCARE report 2001, and yes, and they included the cancer also to these calculations.
Okay, that's helpful.
I have to check again. I'm not sure, but yeah.
Yeah, I also saw something from WHO, but as I said, I didn't find it in publication 103. So.
But they specify to the breast cancer and
Table 33.
Table 33
of UNSCARE report.
Okay.
Okay, so with this presentation, we will move from the calculation and the assessment of the risk to some more broad consideration with regard to what does it mean for the implementation of the system of radiological protection. To be honest, this is really preliminary reflection, and it's not at all exhaustive. I've not addressed notably specifically the medical sector. I was more focused on exposure of population, but we can expand, and I'm sure that I've seen the slide from Friedo. You will come back on some element on medical ethical issue associated with medical sector. So I don't know if we do the two presentations together or we will see how to proceed further, but for sure we will address also this aspect. The way I prepare the presentation is, my first question is, why do we consider heritable effect in the system of radiation protection, and for which purpose? And this is something to be considered. I will come back on that. And then the how we do it, we already discussed during the previous session, what could be done in terms of assessment. But then the key point is also to think what will be the consequences of embarking heritable effect for the implementation of the system of radiation protection, and what does it imply in terms of protective action, in terms of communication as well, with regard to some concern of the public, and which type of messages we can provide. So I will not address all these elements, but just to give you some a few points which could open the discussion. So you have the to change the slide. Okay. Thank you. So in introduction, I just would like to remind you, but Dominique already mentioned that in the previous presentation, heritable effect has been a concern of exposed population for many decades, and we can find that both from ICRP, but also in the literature on chronically exposed population. This is a challenge for addressing this issue for the implementation of the radiological protection system. We have discussed that since the beginning of the workshop. There is limited scientific knowledge on this effect compared to radiation-induced cancer. And so how far we have to go, which type of assumption we have on LNT or so on, and which type of present attitude we may have, and how to explain that. And with regard to that, with this specific issue of heritable effect, there is clearly a need to address ethical and societal issue, and I will come back on that briefly. So I will check different elements, the historical perspective. I will remind you some element from ICRP and why ICRP on bark heritable effect. There are some interesting messages in the first publication of ICRP. Then I will not go too much in the integration in the radiation health treatment we already discussed, but then I will go to the concern of population. We may add that I've not done the concern for population exposed in the medical sector, which could be a significant element. Consideration on the protection of the environment, we have not yet discussed, but then it should be good to have a few words about that. Then to see what is the implementation of the ERP system with the three principles of ICRP. Another element on the organization of the long-term surveillance. And finally, some consideration on legal issue and probability of causation. It doesn't mean that all these elements need to be embarked in ICRP document, but this is some element to be considered when we discuss heritable effect. So first of all, with regard to genetic effect, this is interesting. So Dominique already mentioned that. It was mentioned in the 1950 recommendation of ICRP. That was not yet publication one, that was previous to publication one. And then that was also discussed at the informal meeting held in Stockholm in 52 in connection with a conference on radiobiology. And they, at that time, even before to discuss the risk of cancer, there was discussion about genetic effect of radiation. And in publication one, I just mentioned few sentences. The key element was because of the larger number of persons who would be exposed occupationally, genetic damage assumed greater importance. So this is, first of all, the concern about exposure of large population. And if I remember some previous presentation, it was increasing notably after the atomic bomb and all the tests which have been performed during this period all over the world, and with the concern of chronic exposure due to the fallout of bomb testing. Then there is also another element I just highlight. The consideration, main consideration in the control of genetic damage is a burden to society in future generations. So clearly, we had this element. I will not go too much in detail with that. And then in the publication one, there are so many elements which was clearly connected to the discussion if we want to have the expansion of nuclear energy programs, that was clearly mentioned at that stage like that, and to have more extensive use of radiation, there is a need that genetic damage be considered. And based on that, they mentioned that it is important to assign quota of maximum permissible genetic dose to different modes of exposure. And of course, they also mentioned the limited knowledge about that and the need to have flexibility and not to have too much rigid quota. So this is the way they consider. So this is some element need to be reconsidered and are of interest, because already at this stage, there was a clear link with societal concern with regard to genetic effect, even if we had not too much detail about the capacity of estimating the risk. So I will not go in detail, but you have some element. I mentioned that because it could be useful. And then, of course, we can check the evolution we discussed about publication 60. In publication 103, we clearly mentioned that heritable effects are embarked as a prudent attitude. So I will not go more in detail, but you have the key element with reference to, and of course, we already had that discussion with the application of prudence, but between publication 60 and publication 103 in the calculation of the detriment, that was largely discussed. And of course, all the previous consideration on why to embark heritable effect is after that reflected into the calculation of the detriment. But of course, we may question what does it mean, the prudent attitude. From publication 60, we have 1.3 and 0.8, and with the same prudent attitude, we move to 0.2, 0.1. We may have good explanation, but then for the public, this is something which is questionable. So we need to clearly consider this element. Then, with regard to the concern of population chronically exposed, I was always not in difficult position, but I was always surprised or listening to the people after Chernobyl and after Fukushima. Here you have the result of a survey performed by FMU, the Fukushima Medical University, with Aya Goto and his team, her team. And then this is interesting to see that the main concern of affected population or chronically exposed population, both after Chernobyl and after Fukushima. So you still have the question of thyroid cancer, but just after the thyroid cancer, the key concern is about heritable effect. And then, or heritable effect, or the concern about not to be pregnant because you are in affected area. And then associated with that, the population is confronted to significant psychological distress, partly associated with a concern about future generation. There is a temporal decline in pregnancy intention and breastfeeding, and persistent mother particular concern about their children. And so this is there are some results about survey performed in 2011, 2014, and 2015, even 2017, and even 5 years, 6 years after the accident, there is still some concern. And here you can see the evolution of the concern with regard to the possibility to have heritable effect. I think, yes, the title is missing, sorry. The question was to know if there is a possibility to have heritable effect among the population. And you can see that there is still some significant, very high possibility among the population, even in 2005. So more detailed study are available on that, but we may see that there is still a need to have a clear message with regard to this population. And there are similarities which are expressed. There is a publication last year on the mental health consequences of 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, and they clearly make the link with what have been observed after the A-bomb survivor, that there is a stigma among the population, and clearly there is still some discussion. And when we discuss with the population from Fukushima or from Chernobyl, they always say that some people are not allowed to be married, to marry or reproduce because they are coming from the affected region. So then this is some, not only the perception of the risk, this is the situation that people are living in this affected area. So I will not go too far on this element, but this is some observation, not from the quantitative point of view, but from the societal aspect and the survey which have been performed in affected population. We may, I'm not aware about a similar survey for the medical sector, but probably we may, I discussed briefly with Kimberly, we may add some element on this topic. Then, with regard to protection of the environment, the definition in publication 103 for the protection of the environment is to prevent or reduce the frequency of deleterious radiation effect. And then with regard to that, normally we should consider that heritable effects are already on bark, but according to the presentation yesterday from Christelle, it's not so clear how far this is on bark or not, and what is, because the evolution of the species is clearly on bark in the calculation of the DCRL, but as far as I understood the presentation yesterday, some element with regard to heritable effect are not directly considered in the calculation. So why we may have further discussion, but this is something to be considered. And then, if it is not, why it is not done in DCRL, or can we explain what it is not done, or if we may embark in the future because we have more available data on this topic, it should be good if it is reflected in the definition of DCRL. But the definition of DCRL is once again really the level of more or less deterministic effect for the protection of the environment. So how far we embark stochastic or not, this is something to be considered. And this is some reflection which are going on with the question of ecosystem services, sustainable development, and the link between the quality of the environment and the well-being of humanity. Is it something to be further investigated depending on the knowledge, scientific knowledge on heritable effect for the environment? Probably for the fauna, it's not so challenging. It could be more challenging possibly for animals, including the pets. Do we have to consider something or not? I've no idea on how far to go. Currently, this is a fully open question, and then for sure, for the calculation of the detriment, we have no link with that, but it should be one question. So it's why probably this is a question to be addressed partly in the new task group on ecosystem service, rather than what we can do up to now. Then I just try to think about what does it mean for the three main principles of ICRP: justification, optimization, and limitation of individual exposure. For justification, there is a need to assess the potential harm associated with heritable effect. And then, of course, we may have the link partly with the health, with the detriment, but also with regard to more broadly the concept of well-being of population. And if we embark some societal consideration when we will discuss the benefit and the harm associated with different activity or different exposure situation. In the optimization principle, of course, we may have consideration on tolerability and reasonableness. And if, as we discussed previously, finally, if the heritable effect is a very small part in the calculation of the health detriment, then it will not affect too much the optimization principle. If not, or if for vulnerable population or specific group, or probably in the medical sector, it may have significant consideration for the optimization principle. So that should be more probably discussed more in detail, depending on the type of exposure situation and depending on the group of population concerned. And we discussed with previously the reproductive population. If we have specific affection for this population, it may be of concern. This is the same for we had that concern after Fukushima or after Chernobyl for young generation. What does it mean for the children? Do we have to consider specifically or more in detail this question of heritable effect when we discuss the optimization principle? This is fully an open question. Not sure we have to go too far in this detail, but of course, this is some element to be on board. And of course, with regard to that, in terms of optimization principle, beyond the risk calculation, we need to embark ethical consideration in the dialogue with stakeholders. And I'm sure that Friedo will come back more in detail on this ethical consideration. The same for limitation of individual exposure. We may discuss, depending on the detailed calculations that we can do for heritable effect, how far it could affect the selection of the or the derivation of limitation of individual exposure. So this is clearly associated with the radiation health detriment, which may have an impact on the derivation of those limits. So then the key point could be mainly for most of the situation could be the if we are able to have specific calculation for the detriment. But once again, as we discussed, beyond the limitation of individual exposure in terms of regulatory limit, we may have individual radiological criteria. Specifically, notably, I think about the astronaut, for example, or the public who may be affected after emergency situations. So, and of course, in the medical sector. Then, beyond this element, we had some discussion in the European project some years ago on the long-term surveillance. What does it mean? And this is interesting to see the Shamisen recommendation, which emphasize some needs and challenges associated with long-term health surveillance. And when we discuss the long-term health surveillance, we have seen that in most of the cases, or not in, in most of the cases in epidemiology, you have no observation of heritable effect. But then, does it mean that we have not to embark health surveillance for exposed population? This is clearly the current discussion for A-bomb survivor. This is one discussion for Fukushima affected population. We probably know that from the statistical point of view, we will never observe something, but does it mean that we have not to follow the population? And this is something to be considered. And then it's quite important with regard to that to clarify the objective and the justify the method, the design and the method, and explain the limitation. And of course, we, depending also on the discussion with the number of generation, if we are discussing that we may have impact among 4 or 5 generations, what does it mean? Do we have to continue the health surveillance of population on the long range, and which type of sustainability for such such surveillance, with two purposes. The first one could be to, are we able to have knowledge for risk assessment? But beyond that, how far for the affected population, this is of importance to be embarked and not to be abandoned. So this is something to be considered. And then we may consider similar aspect for the environment, but to be honest, I have no clear view on that, but it should be of interest. Not sure this is a topic for ICRP, but this is clearly a topic for the long-term surveillance in this domain. The last point is with regard to legal issue and probability of causation. This is, I have no clear view on that, but for sure, introducing heritable effect in the radiological detriment implies to see if we consider that we may have effect. What does it mean in terms of compensation and probability of causation? If we have no dose-effect relationships, that will be difficult to do probability of causation. But then for people exposed, they may come back to the authority and to say, okay, if I observe an effect, heritable effect, and I've been exposed, how far I should be compensated, which type of probability of causation system could be put in place or not, and what are the responsibility of the authority, of the operator with regard to that. And then what could be the transfer of responsibility, because then we are speaking about several generations. So it's not only a matter for the people, the authority just who have taken the decision to allow the exposure, or the operator who have the workers occupationally exposed. This is something for the long term, and this is not so trivial. So in conclusion, and some element to open also some further discussion, we have seen that due to after Chernobyl and Fukushima, this is clearly a concern of mother of young children and of pregnant women. They are still very concerned about the situation, and they are looking for explanation. And I remember that several times when we discuss with this population, some experts say, okay, there is no heritable effect that could be observed in your population, so don't worry about that. But then when they are coming back to ICRP publication 103, they saw that you have heritable effect associated with radiation. So is there some effect or not? This is still a concern, and my feeling is that we have no we have no clear statement with regard to that. So is it a matter of communication or better explanation? Probably, but we need to improve this way of presenting the question of heritable effect. There is we may have a review of the concern of people living and working in nuclear installation. I have in mind Sellafield, Lag, legacy site. We also have some concern which have been expressed in Polynesia following the test, the weapon test, and this is something to be considered. The scientific statement are quite important, but not enough to address this issue. Of course, the first element is to consider how to integrate heritable effect in the calculation of the radiation detriment, and we spend more than one day to discuss that. But then there is also some element on ethical issue, and I know that Friedo will come back on that. We have the long-term on health and environmental surveillance, and the importance of the dialogue, the risk culture, and the joint assessment with stakeholders. That could be one element which have been proposed, notably after Chernobyl and after Fukushima. We need to consider seriously the social stigma and the self-stigma, because it's also some individual who are not because of their exposure, they are refraining themselves to consider the possibility to have a future generation. It should be good to investigate the comparison with chronic exposure to other toxic. Have in mind chlordecone or dioxin, and I discussed briefly with our colleague, I do not remember, Parash, who presented yesterday some element. It may be of interest to check what have been done at OECD on this topic when they discuss toxic different pollutants, and not only in terms of risk assessment, but also in terms of risk management. What have been considered, which type of messages they deliver, which type of protections they propose on, based on the scientific knowledge. And possibly we may have link with the research on resilience, and notably because we saw so many concern of population after emergency associated with heritable effect, and then it's how to recover from that. Is it only it's a multi-dimensional aspect, and probably the discussion on the current research on resilience could be of interest on this topic, including, for example, the discussion with regard to COVID-19 may be considered in this aspect. So this is all for opening the discussion. So with that, we have Clémence. Hello, Clémence, you can hear us? Yeah?
Hello, yes, I can hear you. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Welcome.
Sorry for being away yesterday. I had problem in connection.
So with all these elements, I don't know if we open the discussion, if you have questions, comments. It's, yeah, not too many answer. And of course, some element could be of consideration within the task group. Some other are not to be addressed directly in the task group, but could be just highlighted. That was the objective, to not to detail the consequences in the implementation, but to see why, if we embark a heritable effect, what does it mean, and which type of question need to be addressed in one way or another, either by ICRP or by other organizations. Dominique, you want to comment?
No, you said at the beginning that finally what you presented was why do we have to consider, and maybe that's the way we can present the summary, because yesterday and this morning we discussed about how it is integrated, but the question here is why, and maybe we should think about maybe what, or it may be a kind of presentation for the summary also, and if we have to write a paper from that, maybe that could be the right way to do. But I agree with you. That's really why is it needed, and what is expected from the different stakeholders, public and the patient, and so on. So that's really the way to look at that. And after that, I fully agree. Some elements that you raised are again about the scientific knowledge. So the question is, do we have news about the reality of the effect? What can we answer to population after in a contaminated population in a area, or to a patient about the risk for the next generation? I think we have to answer about the potential impact of genetic and non-genetic, epigenetic issues, that kind of thing. So it covers a lot. But in the why, you have the communication, you have the optimization justification, you have different elements that have been listed there. I'm not sure the questions are limited to heritable effects. Some of the questions are very general and could be applied to other effects, but at least we can ask ourselves about the foundation of that. What do we need, and how to answer.
Yeah, there is something which may be questioned, because in fact, all what we discussed since this morning was how to assess and what is the level of risk that we may have. There is something which surprised me when we discuss with people. They don't care about the value. In fact, if it is 0.2, if it is 1%, if it is 2%, at least this is too much. And so we may refine the calculation of the detriment, have stronger assumption and stronger knowledge beside the values that we will use for the calculation of the detriment. At the end, what people will keep in mind is that heritable effect may occur, and then this is a strong concern for them. And they never discuss the value. So this is something which is not so simple, because probably, and we discussed that, why not to forget about heritable effect in the calculation of the detriment? Is it an option? And is it a solution to solve this problem? Not sure, because we have. It's why I came back to the first publication of ICRP, and even before publication one. Since the beginning, even without knowledge, the question of heritable effect was on the table, and that was the main concern. When you see the way it was written, we will never write something like that today, but that was clearly a strong commitment to say, okay, we need to embark genetic effect if we want to secure the use of radiation for man-made activity. But then you never discuss clearly the level of risk, except to define the limit value or so on. But how far, if we refine the calculation of health detriment, we will be happy, because we will understand more in detail what is behind this black box. But then, with regard to discussion with the public, it's not so clear.
I think, I mean, we should have a closer look into this issue. We must do that, because we have to check whether, for example, epigenetics that's new, whether this makes any difference. But then whether to include it in the detriment, this will be answered in 5 years or even later. I mean, this is not a burning issue now, but then maybe in the end, we have to think about it. And even if we decide not to do it, I mean, we must very carefully explain all the elements and then in the end come perhaps to the conclusion it's so small, come on, at least for the calculation of detriment, it will not change anything. So we keep it simple and leave it out. But nevertheless, this is something we have to do in 5 years or later. I found it, by the way, very interesting, and this should be probably done in the paper, which is produced, to have some summary of the historical development, so that it's already there in publication 1. This says that from the beginning, I mean, publication 1 is not the beginning of ICRP, but at least from the 1950s, this was a concern, and even before. So this should be also mentioned or could be mentioned as part of the task group, and how this developed, maybe 2 pages this explaining. So you started already a little bit how this developed, and that it was always there, I guess, because people are concerned. That's the why, one of the answers of the why, because they are concerned anyway, independent on the magnitude. But this should be, I think, included in the paper, a very short summary of the historical development. This would be very helpful, I believe.
Yeah, no, this is interesting to effectively check in which way, what was the main consideration in the different publications to embark heritable effect, and then what was not clear for me if at the end, and notably in publication 103, we continue to embark heritable effect because it has been done at the beginning, or if we have stronger consideration to do it. For sure, if suddenly ICRP decide no more to embark heritable effect, not sure it will be welcome. But then we need to reinforce the statement why we do it, and which type of knowledge are available. But then at the end, and since the beginning, the question of prudence is clearly on the agenda for that. And so it's why we may need to give more detail about this concept.
But anyway, if I remember right, what we heard yesterday from RERF, I mean, their wording was marginally significant or something like that. So, I mean, it seems to me that it at least cannot be ignored. I mean, because you can say it's, well, the probability is low, and it was this 95% confidence level. I think it was from 0. But as she said, I think yesterday, all the point estimates were above 0. So there are some arguments that probably will prevent us to totally ignore it. I mean, that's clear. But anyway, we have to discuss this maybe in 5 years, once it becomes more burning.
I fully agree about the need to have a history section. That's clear. It was said by Eric Grant yesterday. The first study that has been launched was on the children. Before they launch any other study, the first one was the results that have been presented yesterday by Ritsu. And so after that, the answer by Nori Nakamura was that there's no change in his view. It's a little bit more there. It's no more significant. It's still not significant. But finally, before that, that's not because we don't see that it's not there, and we have to remain at the same level, which is prudence, in fact. That's what we can call précaution or prudence. But I agree with you. The perception, the communication will be different if it's only by prudence, and because many people in France, at least, are using the fact that this idea that we never saw anything, clearly it is used by many as it's not existing. That's just something that has been added because of historical issues, and but clearly there's no need for that. And finally, it's almost nothing in the system. Anyway, if today we have some suspicion of an effect in humans, that's something which is very important in the communication. Yeah. And maybe that's something we can do, because from at the beginning of for launching the task group, it was one justification, that there was a real concern by people in contaminated area, in the medical field and so on, that were concerned by the fact that there may be some risk, not for them, but for their children and for the children of their children and so on. So maybe we should try to take this as one of the sections and really think about how to cope with that, or to communicate, or what is the best way for us to talk to these people and to find the right way to do that. Because you said that they don't care about the quantity. That's not my feeling. I think we should try to explain the people. It's true for cancer also. The risks associated to radiation are low. We have to stop thinking about there is a risk or there is no risk, about black and white, about yes or no. Yes, we know that there is a risk, but we know that the risk is very low. And even if we are not able to quantify it precisely, I think we can say that if the risk was huge, if it was as strong as what we can see in the people that have been exposed, then we should have been able to see it right now. So I think we can say that it's lower, but after that, of course, we are not able to quantify it as a 0.2. I would not bet my shirt on that. Yes. But well, I think discussing about trying to change from there is a risk, there is no risk, to I don't know. I know it's very difficult. It's true for radiation. It's true for all the low risks. Environmental risk. It's the same for pesticides and so on. That's very, very, very difficult. Yeah. Yeah, Frido.
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm this or support this, that we do have to look at the perception of people. When I entered radiation biology, and for quite a number of years after I entered, the attitude was very much that this is all radiophobia, and so we don't have to cope with it at all. We don't have to bother with it at all. It is nothing of concern to us, and I'm happy that this has changed, and Thierry has mentioned quite a number of facts about the perception of people, the stigmas that are perceived or that are assumed, and it's good that ICRP takes this seriously and also includes considerations of this into their recommendations. At least not to leave it out and say we have nothing to do with this human or social component. And there is also support from social sciences and humanities for that. I mean, we have now the platform Share in Europe, which includes people that are working on that. So there is some scientific evidence also of this, so we can't just ignore it or push it from the table and say that we have nothing to do with it, but we have to take it seriously. And then, of course, the consequences, it is will probably be more in the field of communication, but there is also something that the ICRP has to look at. How do we communicate? How do we make risk comparisons? Maybe how do we communicate in a way that people are able to to put this in the right perspective. And yeah, I'm just to say that this is something that ICRP should not continue to exclude from its recommendations.
Yeah, two point coming back to what you say, Alfredo. My feeling is that we really need to better characterize what is behind the concept of prudence in terms of heritable effect. And then if we better explain which type of assumption we have, how we build the calculation of the risk, and what is known, what is unknown, all the questions should be clearly addressed. And then based on that, what are the ICRP recommendations in terms of embarking this effect with the concept of prudence. So this is the first point. The second point, I fully agree with you, Dominic. The question of risk assessment is important, but then we have to see how to move from what is done currently for addressing heritable effect when people have been exposed to something where we will be able to have to open the dialogue, not to say since the beginning there is nothing, you have not to take care about that, because then people become crazy. So we need to find a good way to do it, but this is more or less, not exactly, but similarly, what have been done for thyroid cancer after Fukushima. They observed thyroid cancer or thyroid disorder. Then it was a long time for the people, and it's not the end, to see more in detail what is really radiation induced, what is not radiation induced. But if we just explain that there is no risk, this is not a good way to do it. So it's why, with regard to that, I agree with Fredo. We may try to consider what does it mean. So is it a matter for ICRP? We have to check how far to go, but it should be good to work with social scientists, and it's why I already discussed notably with Ayagoto from Fukushima Medical University in order to better engage a dialogue with affected population. So then probably all my question and reflection are mainly focused on chronically exposed population. We may also address this issue for the medical sector because this is also a key concern. But in the medical sector, my understanding is that you will be not with population, you will be with individual, and probably that will be another way to address heritable effect. We have to consider. I have not enough knowledge about that, but that should be considered.
Just to add another variable to the discussion, I am also in a group from the NEA, and often there is the criticism that the assessment of the risk for radiation protection is too, so to say, too much conservative with respect to the other environmental risks. So maybe this is something that I don't know if in this task group or general in the revision of the recommendation, but should be taken into account. So, or to justify why are we more conservative or have another approach, or to make a kind of comparison of the different approaches, because sometimes the criticisms that come from some stakeholder, and they always have these keywords of having a holistic approach, where they mean that you have to consider all the risk at the same way. And
you have some element on what is done in other sectors, in other toxic pollutant, because this is one point that I mentioned that should be good to have to put into perspective and to have better to have more element on what is done in terms of risk assessment and what is done also in terms of risk management on communication on heritable risk.
That was exactly my point. I don't have it, but I just wanted to report that this is often a topic that often comes when the people say we should try to use it in the same or to assess it in the same way.
The question by Thierry was that there was possibility to have a relationship between different directions of OECD, but at the time being, no, we have little ones. The main one is about AOP with the chemical ones, but it's really on the methodology and the technique and not on the communication and so on. But it may be open, yeah.
Yeah, because currently we have no, I don't know if it could be useful not to expand too much, but to see what is done in the other sector, in which way they address heritable effect, if they are doing specific calculation, which type of models they use, and which consequences they have for the implementation of the protection. Does it is it used in the derivation of limit value or some specific consideration both for human and the environment? Then I put a question or one topic on protection of the environment, and we have not addressed at all this issue up to now because we were focused on the calculation of the health detriment. But do we have some consideration or do you have some element on the protection of the environment and how far heritable effects are on bar? I don't know if Clémence has some element or not. No? No, but with regard to ecosystem services, you may consider the quality of the environment. So is there any consideration on type of effect, including heritable effect?
Clearly, I don't know. Yeah. Group C is working on that. So what do we know about transgenerational effects? Because in fact, they are looking at the effect on several generations. So finally, they are looking only at that. Most of the results for ecotox is not on mechanisms, it's not on pathologies like the development of cancer and so on. That's on the fact that the population is stable or increase or there are some changes and it's about the fertility of the motility of sperm so it's based on reproduction and we can consider that it's transgenerational effects, of course, yes. One point we never discussed is about the levels of doses also, because most of the results are doses that are much higher than what we discussed for humans. Yeah.
Question for me, when we speak of ecosystem services, it means there's part of the environment that do some service for like yeah, so for example, cows for milk or something like that, or not only? Okay. because I find this term ecosystem service a little bit, I don't know, because so if I translate in Italian, the ecosystem service seems like something like the company that takes the garbage out or something like that. So.
If we try to summarize that in a summary, what are the most important points that we have to take, and are there some questions that are raised here that are for the other groups? The point about perception, risk perception, risk communication, and so on, in my view, is a very important one.
I have one further question came up to me with your presentation. If we normally when we think on cancer, we always calculate or think on individual risk, independent of the scenario of exposure due to a planned or to an emergency exposure. But maybe just as a thought, is this true in generation effects? Because if we think on recessive autosomal things, etc., they all are calculated, as you have seen before, with a really low impact due to the theory that if one person has a recessive mutation, it won't come up due to the dominant part of a healthy or non-exposed person. But if we have a large exposure and a lot of people exposed, and maybe then several recessive mutations, and then a pair combined, will this impact the risk? So is this a situation we have to differ between a planned and an emergency exposure or broad exposure?
Yeah, probably, but I have to go back on some different publication. My understanding on the emergence of heritable topic among radiation protection was mainly based on the weapon test, because then you had exactly what you said, not only individual exposed, but population. And then this is interesting. It's why I quoted the different sentences from the publication of ICRP, because it was clearly linked with exposure of population and not exposure of individuals. And so it should be of interest to come back on that with regard to historical perspective, to see if it is still at stake, because then when we discuss, it seems, but probably Friedo, you will come back on that for the medical exposure. For medical exposure, we may have a different perspective, and so clearly the emergence was linked to population exposure and the concern that you may have an incidence on the evolution of the population. So this is something to be addressed. And nowadays, when we saw the concern of exposed population, this is basically because you have a group of population which is exposed after Chernobyl, after Fukushima, associated with, and it's not too much. So you may have that with the workers, but it's largely associated with public exposure, the main concern. But this has to be checked in different publication, and for sure, I think that probably in the international conference on Atom for Peace, when at the time of the creation of IAEA, some key discussion on all the generic consideration on why we have to take into account public exposure and so on. That should be of interest to not to go too much in detail, but to quote some few points and to see the statement and the way. Once again, we can embark the prudence, taking into account the knowledge, what could be the assumption made for heritable effect due to these different considerations. But then that should be good to check also in different toxic exposure of population. I have in mind in France we have an island largely contaminated by chlordecone, and this is a public health concern now. And one of the concerns is not only health of current generation, but also the consequences for the future generation. So it should be good to check some few examples where we may have addressed this topic and in which way they address or not this topic. But I don't know if we have feedback. Is Santé Publique France is in charge of that, or INSERM, you know that in France?
Chlordecone, that's the name of pesticide that was specifically used for the banana crops. Very efficient, but not only for to protect bananas. But as far as I understood, they are thinking about the next generation because chlordecone is there for several hundreds of years, and so it's just that. The exposure will remain even if we stop use. Maybe not because it can be transmitted genetically or epigenetically to the next generation. So I have to check. Yeah. And to come back to chemicals, yes, I really think that's something we have to look, but they don't have the problem because effects are considered separately. There is no wish to have a global an indicator reflecting the global burden of an exposure. They are not using detriment, they are not using, and so if the heritable effect is not considered as the major one, then finally it will not be the one that will be considered, you know, to evaluate the potential detriment due to chemical exposure. They are considering the major one, the critic effect. And with the idea that if the critic effect is the first one or the major one, the one with the strongest relationship, if we protect this one, we are going to protect all the other ones. And so the system is very different. So I think heritable effects are considered only when it is reprotoxic or things like that. Outside of that, cancer, as long as cancer is the main effect, it's the one that will be considered without consideration of potential other effects for the next generation. But I can check. I can check. Coming to the point you raised about concern by the public, coming back to the question about perception and communication and so on, one question is, do you think it's important for the population to consider what is the mechanism? Is it transgenerational? Is it due to genetic or epigenetic, or to separate exposure in utero and exposure before conception? That's for the medical field, yes, it is. But for the persons in a contaminated area, I'm not sure. Because here we divided it in different groups according to the type of effect, or at least before conception and after conception. And everything that we discussed up to now in Group D was heritable effects. We did not discuss at all, or almost not at all, about effects of in utero exposure.
Yeah, I will speak about that a bit more. But I wanted to say something about this very point that you are raising. I don't think for the communication with the public it is so important to have all these details about mechanisms, etc. But overall, I think it is important to be able to say that we considered all the aspects and that we did look at all the diseases in general. So in detail. So I think one should maybe actually put more effort into this detriment calculations and not just have a pauschal 0.8 factor or something. Although you are right, of course, that it is a very small percentage of the overall detriment, but in order to communicate with the public and say that we have considered all the issues and we have not made it easy for ourselves. We have not just give it a pauschal, I don't know, 5% or something, but we have really looked at different kinds of diseases and what kind of suffering they bring and what kind of burden they bring. I think that is important for the communication. And even to be able to say that we do consider all these aspects in radiation protection, and they are not mostly considered in chemical protection. So we are actually doing our best to protect the public. I think that's an important issue. I mean, of course, we have to weigh how much effort do we want to make in this details, but yeah, I think it's an advantage that we have in radiation protection that we can say something like that.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, Fredo. My feeling is that we have not to expand on which type of risk communication we need to develop. But the first point, as we mentioned, is to open the black box and to explain, to have more detail which type of assumption is made, which type of knowledge is available, and then based on that, it's clear that we may have open dialogue with affected population. And then we don't say, okay, this is this figure, but you don't know what is behind that. You have more available detail. We have to find a way to be not to be too complicated, because if we just put the equation, the preferred equation from Dominique with different factors, then it will be not understandable by the people. So we need to find a way to have this detailed calculation, and then to have a clear explanation in plain language in order to then open the discussion. And then if but this is no more the business of ICRP to go more in detail in the discussion with the public, but to give all the elements and the approach in order to be able to address that properly when we will be confronted to chronic exposure.
So it's clear we must give the perception that we take it seriously. We took it seriously, and whatever comes out. Yeah, and if it's small, then it's small, and if it's big, larger, then it's larger. But we cannot just say, "Oh, forget it." But if we take, I mean, just the fact that we have this task group now demonstrates already that ICRP takes this topic seriously, and this task group will work for three years, I guess. But this is, I think, the critical thing. We should show we take your concerns seriously. We took them seriously, And we did that, and you can check if you wish the details. And it turned out that we decided to whatever we decided. Yeah, I think that's the right way to go in any other, not just for this topic, for other topics as well.
Further, you have a question, yep, or comment?
I'm absolutely with you, but I think as ICRP, we should focus on the scientific path, not on the. We shouldn't think on it how to communicate it, but how to do it with a needed scientific depth and precision, but clear enough for the communication colleagues to understand it and then build the message, and not to come the way that we first think of the message and how to communicate it, and then to try to adopt the scientific, but really to be as precise and as complicated as needed for this topic, but as clear and as well documented as possible that the communication part can understand it. Because other way, I don't think it would keep the goal.
Okay.
So what I learned from the social sciences and humanities, that whatever we do, we should keep communication in mind from the beginning. And that's why I thought, I mean, we should do that because we, in the end, have to give the impression that we take it seriously. So that's why we start with oh, no, we demonstrate, we should demonstrate. And this also holds for other things. If we change the system, we should from the beginning, should we change it? I don't know, but we should from the beginning keep in mind that we have to communicate whatever we do. So that's why when we had yesterday the discussion on the new dose quantity or whatever it is, so we should keep in mind from the beginning, if we go for that, we have to communicate that. And this, so that's, I learned from the BFS colleagues dealing with communication, risk communication at our last SSK Klausurtagung retreat, you know, during a beer in the evening at 11 o'clock. That was.
I can try to interpret what you were saying is that we should not try to simplify too much the things just because we are worried that if it's complicated, then it will not be understood. So of course we have to keep the communication in mind, but to be as rigorous as possible. I think that was our idea.
Yes, exactly. So I absolutely, we have to after the communication and on focus, but on terms that we enable good communication. Not our goal is good communication, but to enable it at the end of the process. That this is indeed correct. We have to keep it in mind at the beginning, but yeah.
About the other points you raised, justification, optimization, so implementation in the system, I'm not sure we have to deal specifically with that, especially in the medical field maybe, but that's a point we have to discuss in more details. And after that, what are the main points you would like to take out for the summary from your presentation? So the importance to consider the history, the importance of taking into account the perception, the communication, and you raised the heuristic points also, and the probability of causation. But I'm I'm not sure we can say so much about that today or even in 5 years. And we have to change the organization of the team.
Yeah, no, according to the discussions that we had, I think the first point is really to come back on the historical perspective, because then we can understand why and to focus on the why it has emerged and then why we continue to consider heritable effect. Then that will be fed by all the scientific knowledge and so on. But then the first element is that. The second point is when we will say why is, but this is we will come back to the detriment. We need to have a clear explanation on what are the assumptions behind the risk assessment, and notably in which way we embark the concept of prudence, and to be clear with that. And I fully agree that we need to have detail, scientific detail, and the different type of assumption. But then this is something that we try to do in several publications from Committee 4, was to try to have as much as possible some element in plain language. That means that even if we may have scientific detail and scientific background and so on, in some part of the document, we need to explain clearly where we are. And so then if people want to have more detail, they can do it, because it's funded. You have the scientific elements, you have the different steps, the assumptions which are made, but we have to explain clearly what we have done and what we embark, why we do it, and so on. So and it's with regard to heritable effect, we may have the feeling that in the previous publications there were detailed discussion, notably about the doubling dose, or in the last publication. But at the end, if you come back to publication 103 or even publication 60, you are not able to have a clear view of what is done and what is behind, why we embark that, and what are the assumptions. So we need to be to check how to express that, which is not a simple exercise, but we need to have a clear messages. And then with regard to communication, I will not go too much in terms of we clearly need we clearly need to have in mind that our publication will be, or paper will be used by people to try to understand the situation. So we need to see how to communicate the messages. But besides that, in order to, because one of the questions of the people say, is it safe or not to live in some areas, and or to be exposed? Maybe we will come back on that, on the medical exposure, to have this type of exam and so on. What will be the risk for me and for the future generation? With regard to that, my feeling is that we may, and this has been done notably in publication 146 with emergency and recovery situation, we need to provide the means for the people to do the evaluation, because together with the expert, but we cannot say for this type of exposure situation, the risk is this and that and that. We need to provide the means for a joint assessment of the situation at the end. And this is probably some element on which we may further consider some short recommendation on that. Any comment on the screen, Friedo, or no? It's okay. Then you will have the floor after lunch.
Yeah, we have no experts. Maybe Geraldine is still online. Maybe we should speak a little bit about medical radiation protection.
Thanks, Chairman. Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's an awful lot to unpick in all of this. I think when we're talking about medical, we've two groups. We obviously have our patients and our staff, and they're two very different groups. For the patients, we're talking about partial exposures. So in terms of optimization measures, I think it will be important to understand if there's anything particular that we should be recommending there arising out of these discussions. And also our patients can be grouped, their particular exam types, their particular age groups, gender. There, are sort of frequent flyers who are having many exposures, often of similar sort of exams. So are there particular recommendations for those? And then, of course, because these are planned exposures, the benefit is very significant compared to the detriment. The justification issues are very different for this particular group. And I mean, I think a lot of the discussion has talked about, the need to understand the science and, what are the effects, what are the risks, what underlies the calculations and the computations. And I think for those who are drafting recommendations, for those who are trying to implement recommendations, absolutely, we need to understand what the assumptions are. And if they are changing, we need to understand why that is so we can communicate that out to both our regulators or the people responsible for drafting the legislation, and then ultimately to those working in healthcare and our patients, that we can communicate, and we have a scientific basis for that. In terms of what we communicate, I can tell you patients don't care about the numbers, they don't understand the numbers, but they do want to understand relative risks, and how this compares to baseline, and what are the consequences of having a particular exam, and our staff do as well. So communicating risks in a form that people can understand is really important. And for those that are responsible for communicating it, whether it's the regulators or the practitioners in healthcare, we need to understand what the risks are. And that gives us a sound basis for trying to package the message in a form that our patients and our staff can understand. And I think what's absolutely essential is to understand that very often when we're talking about particularly, women who are pregnant, might be pregnant, trying to get pregnant, the perception of risk is every bit as important as the risk itself. So we need to recognize that and respect it in terms of the systems of radiation protection that we have. It's not just about the science, that's our starting point, but understanding, that we're dealing with people is really important. And I think, so I think the communication is really important, but building the message, so that we can then package that, in an appropriate way is important. I think one of the things that's really welcome over the last couple of years about ICRP is just the increased level of transparency and accessibility. It was always quite difficult for even those of us working in radiation protection to have access to the documentation because, it was prohibitively expensive. So that free access and the sort of the willingness to invite others in, I think is incredibly important because it gives a sense that there's, it's not a hidden process, it is something that we can all either contribute to or at least be an observer to. And that's really, really important in sort of trusting the message and having confidence in the message. I mean, I think that the deliberations that we had yesterday, they're really important. And if the numbers are going to change and that how those numbers are arrived at and how that is communicated is really you know, it is important. Our patients won't care, but the people who are, you know, responsible for radiation protection will care, and maintaining confidence in ICRP and, you know, the scientific processes that underlie the computation. I think it is important that we, you know, that is shared and that is understood. So, you know, I don't have anything particular else to add. I mean, I think the discussions this morning have been very useful in just starting to shape the thoughts about, like, what are the consequences for the implementation, which is the, you know, the task of this group. How will this change what we do, or will it change it at all? If we protect against cancer, are we, you know, are we adequately protected? Or are there certain groups that actually were not adequately protected, and particularly in medical, where it's partial exposures for our patients. So it's quite a different and particular groups, and you can see, you know, there's lots of stats available to tell you what groups you're exposing, and the sort of exams that they get. So how we shape the way that we work in healthcare and the advice that we give about scanning patients, particularly with, you know, the increase in health screening, where we're using high dose techniques on, you know, sometimes patients that would fall into the group that we might be concerned about in the topics that we're discussing. So maybe just a few thoughts, not necessarily in a very logical format, so apologies for that, but just some reflections on the discussions that we've had so far. Thank you.
You are saying that we have to take into account the new knowledge from science, but are there specific issues that are raised in the medical field? I remember from discussion on the first day or previous one, I don't remember, about the delay before conception for people having radiation therapy. What is the delay before radiation protection for fertility? And I think most of the questions are rather on exposure during in utero exposure more than heritable effects. So about the risk for before conception. Am I right? Or I think most of the question is to prevent the pregnant woman and to prevent exposure in utero, even when the mother doesn't already know that she's pregnant. But most of the questions are related to in utero exposure more than heritable effects.
I would say, just from working in healthcare, that absolutely that would be the primary concern. And particularly when we're talking about radiotherapy and radionuclide therapy, which is one of the areas that I would work in quite a bit, and just trying to completely rule out pregnancy for these groups. You know, it actually can be quite challenging, even with modern medicine. It's not as foolproof as you might think. So that definitely, I would say, is a primary concern for our high dose exposures. And then for the other exposures, which, you know, are not quite so significant, it still is a concern for, say, CT of abdomen, pelvis. You know, it is a concern to make sure that we exclude pregnancy, and very sometimes much more a concern with the patient than in some groups of healthcare. And I think that's probably, we still have some way to go in just improving the recognition of these concerns among our patient groups. And, you know, there has been a change over the last 30 years in what we consider a reasonable thing to do in terms of scanning patients in the first part of the menstrual cycle. So, you know, there isn't a complete consensus on that, I would say. But you're right. I think the concerns in healthcare tend to be more about in utero exposure and the consequences for that, and deterministic effects less so than hereditary effects.
I just wanted to add, so okay, maybe it's just a little bit of biased statistics, but it's true that the majority. So we at the BFS we often get inquiries from patients about being irradiated or having a radiation therapy. And it's true that the majority are worried or concerned about in utero exposure, but we not rarely also get questions from people that they have got some also diagnostic examination or therapeutic examination, and so they worry about their possibility to transmit some damages to the child. So it's a worry. It's not the majority, but it's some people are concerned.
Okay, and but for medical radiation protection, I think we have to about the justification, about optimization. Maybe that's more. The questions are maybe more important there. So maybe a specific section in our summary about medical radiation protection in the medical field should be worthwhile. In the afternoon, okay.
I think maybe, Chairman, if I could just add one further comment. So while in utero exposures are important, certainly in radionuclide therapy, we often get questions about avoidance of pregnancy and how long after. And I think when you look across the international guidelines, there isn't a complete consensus about that. And while I think as scientists, we understand that it's not an exact science, and, you know, is it 4 months, 6 months, 12 months? And what are the differences between those? That's a hard challenge to communicate that to either patients or healthcare professionals, that, you know, that there isn't one number that you can, you know, for a particular radionuclide or radiopharmaceutical, that you can say it's this time. So, you know, there's also something to be thought about in medical exposures. Thank you.
I think one point that should change from the literature, epidemiological literature, especially, is about the risk of cancer after in utero exposure, which appears to be much stronger after several meta-analyses in the recent years than it was in the past. So because I think, discussing with people involved in the medical radiation protection, that the most concerns are above 100 milligray for the occurrence of potential, you know, mental retardation and deterministic effects, but little importance is given to lower doses, which may change with the introduction of or better introduction of potential stochastic effects, even at doses below 100 millisieverts. I don't know if that's a point of discussion. I'm not sure it will be the consequence of the literature review, but it should be done by Richard. And if I read the last papers, that's what I understood from that. Okay, so maybe we can stop now. It's Frido, sorry. Yeah.
No, just because Geraldine spoke about the question of patients when it would be safe again to think of children, I think we didn't discuss that at all, because yesterday it was mentioned that the first investigations about genetic effects started, I don't know, 3 years after the in Hiroshima, Nagasaki, 3 years after the exposures happened. So just an ignorant, stupid question. Is there anything in any of the ICRP recommendations about about the timing of exposure and fertilization? And if it is not, should it be somehow addressed?
Clearly, I don't know. We have to go back to this to the literature on high doses and deterministic effects. But I agree with you. That's a question I heard several times about the delay before conception. Is there some recommendation about waiting for 2 weeks, 1 month, or I don't know, more, 1 year? And maybe that's a question we have to ask ourselves, or to look at the literature if we can have any reasonable answer about that. I don't know.
As I think Geraldine already said, that there are some recommendation in nuclear medicine, but it is more about the residual activity in the patients after the test. But I don't know if there are some recommendations related to the possibility of the hereditary effects.
Okay, so I propose we stop now if there is no more questions, and we meet again at 2:15. That's what is in the schedule. So 2:15 in the room, and in between we change a little bit the organization of the tables. Okay, so have a nice lunch, and see you at 2:15.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.